all kind of got kicked off when we managed to sequence the first ancient human genome, because that gave us an enormous amount of data.
For centuries, we believed Vikings were fully human in the way history defines it. One people, one bloodline, one origin. But after decoding DNA from more than 400 Viking skeletons, researchers uncovered something unsettling. Viking DNA contains genetic material that does not belong to any single Scandinavian group. It includes genes from Southern Europe, the Middle East, and even Asia, entering their bloodlines long before the Viking Age began. They didn't come from a single lineage as initially thought. That discovery changes everything we thought we knew and forces us to ask a dangerous question. If Vikings weren't defined by blood, then what actually made someone a Viking? Let's find out. The Viking image. For most of history, Vikings were described as one clear type of people, born in the north, shaped by cold lands, and linked by the same blood. History books presented them as a single group that originated in Scandinavia and expanded outward through raids and conquest. Over time, this idea became so familiar that no one questioned it. This image did not come from science. It came from later interpretations. Medieval writers, European historians, and 19th century artists helped shape it. They wanted strong origins and clear identities, so they simplified the past. Vikings became symbols of strength, purity, and northern dominance, rather than real people with complex lives. As this version spread, it hardened into fact. Movies repeated it. Books repeated it. Classrooms repeated it. Eventually, the Viking was no longer seen as a role someone took on, but as something you were born into. Blood and identity became the same. Archaeology supported parts of the story, but not all of it. Graves revealed weapons, ships, jewelry, and signs of travel. But bones alone could not explain ancestry. Hair color and height were estimated. Burial customs were compared. Yet none of this could answer the deeper question of who these people truly were. Because that question remained unanswered, assumptions filled the gap. The idea of a single Viking people grew stronger simply because there was no way to challenge it. Any evidence that did not fit was ignored or explained away as an exception. The image stayed clean, simple, and wrong. Then technology changed the rules. Once scientists learned how to extract ancient DNA from skeletons, the Viking story entered new territory. For the first time, researchers could examine ancestry directly rather than infer it from appearance or location. The bones were no longer silent. They carried records written deep inside the cells. When the first results came in, they did not support the old image. Some skeletons found in Scandinavia did not match local genetic patterns. Others showed traits that suggested distant origins. As more samples were tested, these patterns persisted. They grew clearer. The more DNA was analyzed, the harder it became to defend the idea of the Vikings as one people with a single origin. What had once seemed unified began to look layered, mixed, and connected to regions far beyond the north. That realization forced researchers to confront an uncomfortable truth. If Vikings were not defined by shared blood, then the word Viking meant something else entirely. And once that door opened, the subsequent discovery made the story even harder to ignore. The DNA discovery. That realization forced researchers to stop relying on old assumptions and turn to something more direct, something that could not be shaped by stories or national pride. They turned to DNA. This was not a small project or a quick test. It took 6 years to complete and involved some of the world's best genetic researchers. Scientists collected DNA from more than 400 Viking Age skeletons found across Scandinavia, Britain, mainland Europe, and even Greenland. These remains came from different burial sites, different regions, and different time periods within the Viking Age. The goal was simple but powerful. Researchers wanted to see where these people actually came from, based on their genes rather than their graves. Ancient DNA is challenging to work with. It breaks down over time and is easily damaged by soil, water, and bacteria. Each sample had to be cleaned, protected, and tested with extreme care. Even then, many samples failed, but enough survived to form a clear picture. And that picture did not match expectations. Instead of finding one shared Scandinavian genetic pattern, scientists found many. Some individuals matched local northern ancestry, but many did not. Their DNA showed links to southern Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. These were not rare cases. The patterns appeared repeatedly across different sites. Even more surprising was the timing. This mixing did not start after Viking raids began. It existed before the Viking Age officially started. That means people with foreign ancestry were already living in Scandinavia long before longships appeared on foreign shores. This discovery changed how researchers understood movement in the ancient world. Scandinavia was not isolated. It was connected by trade routes, migration paths, and social ties that reached far beyond what historians once imagined. The DNA also challenged visual assumptions. Many individuals did not carry genes linked to blonde hair or light features. Some had darker traits. Others carried combinations that could not be placed into a single category. The idea of a uniform Viking appearance no longer made sense. Most importantly, the data showed that ancestry did not determine who became a Viking. People with very different genetic backgrounds were buried with the same weapons, followed the same customs, and lived similar lives. Their bones told a shared cultural story, but their DNA told many different ones. This forced researchers to rethink the word Viking itself. It could no longer mean a race or a bloodline. It pointed to something social, something chosen, something learned. By the end of the study, one conclusion became clear. Viking identity spread faster than Viking genes, and culture moved more freely than blood ever could. If DNA did not define a Viking, then the line between insider and outsider was thinner than anyone expected. That raises an unsettling but straightforward question. If ancestry did not matter, then how many people lived and died as Vikings without ever being born as one? The actual Viking lineage. That question became clearer as scientists compared Viking graves from different regions. When researchers examined the DNA more closely, they saw that Vikings from different parts of Scandinavia were not closely related. People buried in Norway shared genes mostly with nearby areas. Those buried in Sweden showed different genetic patterns. Danish graves formed their own groups. These people lived at the same time, used similar ships, tools, and weapons. Yet their DNA showed they did not share a standard family line. This meant the Viking world was not one united people. It was made up of several groups who followed the same way of life but came from different backgrounds. The data also showed that Vikings mixed with local populations wherever they settled or traveled. This was not rare or temporary. People married locals, started families, and stayed. Over time, these connections became permanent parts of the population. In many cases, individuals buried in clear Viking-style graves had no Scandinavian ancestry. Yet, they were treated no differently. They were buried with weapons. They were placed in honored positions. Their graves showed respect and status within Viking society. This pattern appeared again and again. The findings showed that being a Viking was not about ancestry. It was about behavior and role. If someone lived by Viking rules, joined their raids or trade networks, and supported the group, they could belong. This helps explain how the Vikings spread so quickly across large areas. Family lines did not limit them. They could grow by accepting new members. Skills mattered more than origin. Loyalty mattered more than blood. This structure made Viking groups flexible. They could adapt to new places, learn from locals, and change when needed. They could operate in small groups without needing approval from a central authority. This made their movement fast and hard to control. It also explains why Viking activity appeared different across regions. Groups acted independently. Some focused on raiding. Others focused on trading or settling. They shared methods but not leadership or ancestry. By this point, researchers understood that the Viking Age was not one organized invasion. It was many connected groups moving in similar ways, often without working together, and often with very different origins. This shift in understanding changed how scientists viewed Viking travel beyond Scandinavia. If Viking identity was shared and flexible, then their reach was likely wider and more complex than anyone had assumed. The Viking impostors. That wider reach became clearer when researchers studied Viking graves far away from Scandinavia. One of the clearest examples came from Scotland. Archaeologists had found graves that followed clear Viking customs. The bodies were buried with swords. The burial style matched known Viking practices. For a long time, historians believed these were Scandinavian warriors who had traveled west. DNA testing changed that belief. When scientists examined the remains, they found that some individuals had no Scandinavian ancestry. Their DNA matched local Scottish and Irish populations. These people were born locally. They did not come from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, yet they were buried as Vikings. This showed something important. Viking identity could be learned and adopted. It was not limited to people born in Scandinavia. If someone joined a Viking group, followed its rules, and lived its way of life, they were accepted. This pattern was not limited to one place. Similar findings appeared in other regions with Viking presence. Local people joined Viking crews. Some fought alongside them. Others traded, traveled, and settled with them. Over time, the difference between Viking and non-Viking became less clear. This helped explain why Viking influence spread so quickly. It was not only through force, it was also through attraction. Viking life offered access to trade, movement, and power. For many locals, joining the Vikings may have offered better chances than staying behind. The DNA evidence also showed that Viking crews were often mixed groups. People from different regions sailed together. They shared danger, work, and reward. Their bond came from cooperation, not shared ancestry. This explains why Viking sites across Europe look similar even when the people involved were not. The tools, ships, and customs spread faster than genes did. Culture moved freely, while bloodlines remained mixed and varied. It also explains why Viking activity looked different from place to place. Some groups focused on raiding, others focused on trading or settling. They used similar methods, but acted independently. By this point, researchers understood that Vikings were not a single invading population. They were a flexible system that could include outsiders. This system allowed people from many backgrounds to become part of the Viking world. That realization changed how historians looked at the Viking movement as a whole. If Viking identity could be adopted in the West, similar mixing and movement likely occurred in other directions as well. The Eastern connection. That pattern of movement in many directions became clearer when researchers studied the Viking routes to the east. While some Vikings traveled west toward Britain and Europe, others moved east. Groups from what is now Sweden followed rivers rather than the oceans. They sailed through the Baltic Sea and into the river systems of Eastern Europe. These rivers connected small settlements to large trade centers. DNA evidence supports this movement. Skeletons linked to these eastern routes showed genetic markers distinct from those found in Western Viking groups. Some of these markers pointed to contact with people from Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. This was not a single event. The same genetic signals were observed across many samples, indicating long-term contact and mixing. These Eastern Vikings were mainly traders. They moved goods like furs, silver, and weapons over long distances. Along the way, they met merchants from many regions. Some of these traders came from areas connected to the Silk Road. Trade brought people together, and people often stayed. Over time, these meetings led to families and settlements. Some people traveled north with Viking groups and settled in Scandinavia. This explains why some Viking Age skeletons found in the north carried genetic markers from the east. Scandinavia was not isolated. People moved in and out regularly. New ideas, skills, and family ties entered through these routes. Identity followed trade, not borders. These Eastern connections also helped Viking groups adapt. They learned new ways to travel, fight, and trade. They adjusted their tools and methods based on what worked in different regions. This made them more flexible and effective. By studying these routes, researchers saw that Vikings were part of a vast network that connected distant lands. They were not acting alone. They were linked to larger systems of movement and exchange. This understanding dispelled the notion of the Vikings as a closed northern group. If people from far away could become part of Scandinavian life through trade and settlement, then Viking identity was never fixed to one place or one people. It followed movement, contact, and shared activity. When Viking became an identity, that idea of identity following movement became clearer when researchers examined how Viking groups actually operated in daily life. The DNA evidence showed that Viking society was open. It did not depend on family lines or shared ancestry. Instead, it relied on shared rules, skills, and trust. People worked together to sail ships, trade goods, raid settlements, and survive long journeys. These tasks required cooperation, not common blood. This explains how Viking groups grew so quickly. They did not need to wait for new generations. New people could join if they learned the skills and followed the group. Loyalty and ability mattered more than where someone was born. Historical records support this. Viking crews were often made up of people from different places. These groups came together for specific goals, such as trading or raiding. When a mission ended, the group could change or break apart. This made Viking activity flexible and fast. Burial evidence tells the same story. People with very different genetic backgrounds were buried in similar ways. They used the same tools and followed the same customs. This shows that Viking society judged people by their role and actions, not by ancestry. Over time, this system allowed Viking culture to spread widely. Ships, tools, and customs moved faster than people. Culture stayed even when bloodlines changed. This is why Viking influence is evident in many regions where Scandinavian DNA is scarce. Eventually, this open system slowed down. Kingdoms formed, borders became stronger, trade routes shifted, movement became harder. The Viking way of life faded as conditions changed, but the people did not disappear. The DNA study does not erase the Vikings. It places them back into history as real humans, people who moved, mixed, adapted, and changed with their world. In the end, the main finding is clear. Vikings were not defined by where they came from. They were defined by what they did. The modern trace. That focus on what the Vikings did, rather than where they came from, also shaped what remained long after the Viking Age ended. When researchers compared ancient Viking DNA with modern populations, they found that Viking genetic traces persist today, but not in the way many people imagine. In parts of Britain, Ireland, and Northern Europe, a noticeable number of people carry some Viking ancestry. This shows that Viking movements left lasting marks on human populations, not only in history books and place names. At the same time, modern people living in Scandinavia are not exact genetic matches to their Viking Age ancestors. Over hundreds of years, new waves of migration, marriage, and settlement slowly changed the genetic makeup of these regions. This means that being Swedish, Norwegian, or Danish today does not automatically imply being genetically Viking in the historical sense. This discovery challenges modern ideas about heritage and identity. Some groups have used Viking history as a symbol of purity or fixed ancestry. The DNA evidence shows that this idea does not match reality. Vikings were highly mixed. They absorbed people from many regions and were changed by those connections. Their strength came from openness rather than isolation. The research also explains why Viking culture spread so widely and lasted so long. Tools, ship designs, trade methods, and social rules moved faster than people themselves. Communities adopted Viking practices when they were useful and adapted them to local needs. Culture traveled freely, even when bloodlines stayed mixed. What remains today is not a pure Viking lineage, but a shared human record of movement and contact. The Viking Age appears less like a story of one group conquering others, and more like a period of intense connection between distant regions. Trade routes linked villages and cities. Travel created shared knowledge. Cooperation shaped survival. This understanding makes the Vikings easier to relate to, rather than more distant. They faced decisions about belonging, opportunity, and risk in a changing world. They moved when movement offered better chances. They settled when it made sense. They adapted when conditions changed. In the end, the DNA evidence does not reduce the importance of the Vikings. It places them more clearly within human history. They were not a separate or superior group. They were people shaped by movement, mixing, and change, just as every society before and after them was. That may be the most critical trace they left behind. The DNA did not destroy the Viking story. It corrected it. Vikings were not defined by blood or origin, but by movement, choice, and shared action. That makes their story more human, not less. We hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel if you don't want to miss out on more crazy stories like this. We'll catch you in the next one.